In this video, we're going to talk about integrating user input into a program. So the last thing that I want to show you about user input is how to integrate it then into a program. We're just going to do a simple example of accepting one user input and then making that affect our program. We're going to go back to our Card Wars example that we've been using. So as you can see, I have again done some things with our CSS, and I've created a new element here that is a select drop-down list. And we're basically going to use that as an introduction into the program. So users have to select how many decks they want to play with before we start the game. I basically just coded that with some simple CSS. You should be able to understand all of that. I did contain the entire visible part of the game HTML in a section with the ID all game. And then I just said all game is hidden. And notice I'm using the # here instead of a dot or anything else, because I'm selecting it by ID. If you want to use an ID as a selector to apply CSS, you use the #. Now, what we want to do is we want to detect when there's some kind of change in this select box and use that as the trigger to get to the next thing. Because if you notice, there's no button or anything else here. So that's easy to do. We can use the property on change rather than on click, right? We don't want it just when they click on it. We actually want when there's a change in value, which means they can't use 0. So that will force it to be 1, 1 through 4. And when the user changes the value, then it will trigger show game, the function show game. So the function show game, all that does is change the visibility of this to hidden. So that's going to make that disappear. I'm also just to be on the safe side, I'm also changing the height of this box to 0, so it just is completely gone. So just so there's no conflict, it's not overlaying my other layer. And then I'm going to take all game and I'm going to set that equal to visible. And then once that's visible, we have the card that's got the button and we can start our game and all that, right? So let's just check that out. I'm going to change it to 2, and that works just fine. So now we're back to our normal interface. We hid the other one, and then we can go ahead and play. Now, the only tricky thing here, if we're using multiple decks, we need to change the logic of our load deck function, right? Because that's where we're actually figuring out how many cards we have. That took just a little bit of thinking in order to figure it out. I knew I would need a nested loop. Each deck, so J is representing how many decks. And oh yeah, actually that's kind of an interesting, tricky thing. So now that I'm on this page, on this screen, and the other one has disappeared, how do I know how many decks the user wanted to use? Well, interestingly enough, even though that drop-down box is hidden, it's still there on the screen, and the value is still sitting there in it. So even though I have hidden it away, I actually can still get the value from it. Right? It's still sitting there. So I just went ahead and grabbed the value. Of course, I changed it into a number. And then I'm going to use that number, the number of decks, as an outer loop, right? So I want to go through 1, 2, 3 times. So I'm going to go 0 to less than num decks. So 0, 1, 2 is technically what it's going to be. And for each of those, I am going to run through my 0 through 12 process of adding in the cards. Now, the thing is, I can no longer use I as my index value in the arrays themselves, because if I did that, then I would just overwrite 3 times 0 through 12 in the arrays. And I don't want to do that. I want to keep appending on to the end. So I had to create a separate variable called index val. And index val starts at 0. As you can see, I initialized it at 0. And then I'm just going to increment it at the end of each of those for loops. So while I cycles back through 0 through 12 3 times, index val will keep counting, right? So index val is going to keep counting out. So let me just demonstrate. I left a couple of the alerts in here, but just deactivated just so you could see. Okay, so index val is now equal to 13. We've got our array as we want it, 2 through 14. And now index val set at 26, and we have our array, and it goes 2 to 14 and 2 to 14 again, which is exactly what we want. So we've got 2 decks worth of cards. And I'm showing spades, but it's going to do that for all of the different ones. And then we can go ahead and play. If as we play, we watch, we will see that we're only going to get 2 instances of each card going through. So it actually works just as we thought. And we didn't have to do a ton more to it, right? I just put in 3 lines of code up here, and then I just had to change the logic a little bit in my load deck function. That's an example of integrating our user input into a program.